Okay, it is, yes, it is 5:30 on the dot. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I would like to welcome you to another exciting talk in our public lecture series, What Do Scientists Do? My name is Tanya Reinhardt, and I'm the Science Center Coordinator here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And just before we start, just some housekeeping rules. Please make sure that you muted your microphone. If you don't know where it is, it's at the bottom left of your screen. And to save bandwidth, please switch off your videos as well. And this is quite important because our guest speaker for this evening, he's not in town, so he might have otherwise have problems. As to questions, you can either ask Professor Mabhaudhi live at the end of the lecture, or you can post your question in the chat. If you get cut off because of load shedding, please don't panic. We will make sure that the lecture is available online. It is now, as always, a very great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, all the way from Hotspur in Limpopo. Is that right, Tafadzwa? Are you in Hotspur?
Yes, that's where I am.
Okay, so Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi, and the title of tonight's talk is Our Food, Our Heritage, Our Health. Just a brief introduction about our guest speaker for tonight. Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi is an honorary research associate professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham, not in England, but in Malaysia. Tafadzwa has experience in research, development, capacity building, and building partnerships across academia, public and private sectors, civil society, and communities. He conducts multi- and transdisciplinary research covering sustainable and resilient food systems, global environmental change, and the water-energy-food nexus. His goal is to work on research and development that is dynamic, transformative, informs policy, and achieve real-life impacts within poor communities. And I think this is so, so important. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Tafadzwa, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for inviting me over to this platform. I'm somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Hoedspruit. So I'll keep my camera off for the duration of the presentation, just to save bandwidth on my side. But yeah, so to kickstart with, when I was invited for this talk, to give this talk, I thought of talking about something that is quite passionate to me, which is the issue of food, heritage, and health. My research straddles the key areas of agriculture, environment, and health, or some would call it food systems now and health. So I thought, let me talk to that subject and just share some of what we are doing, or what I've been doing over the years in that regard. So just to give a background to some of this work, we are located in Africa, and one of the things of concern is the high levels of poverty in Africa. The high levels of malnourished people. There had been progress, but since 2018, we've been losing that progress. The numbers have been increasing again. A large percentage of the population still resides in
Tafadzwa, you breaking up? Tafadzwa, are you still there?
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. So I was just talking about the context in Africa around the rural livelihoods the reliance of people on agriculture as a livelihood activity, and the fact that agriculture is being heavily impacted by climate change. Africa, as we know it, and as has been confirmed, IPCC reports, is one of the continents most vulnerable to climate change. It is a climate hotspot. Because of the context of most of the people and governments, we have low adaptive capacities. And this is worsened by the history of Africa, which has created huge inequalities, which are now translating into unemployment and perpetuating poverty, which are challenges that we are struggling with in South Africa. And we also have issues to do with how our policies have been responding to it, and the lack of consideration for interlinked issues, such as understanding the benefits of biodiversity and how we can link it to addressing issues of poverty, inequality, and cohesion. A lot of the focus that we have and a lot of the adaptation strategies that we have are mostly geared towards economic development. And that is because of an understanding that says we need to grow our economies. And as our economies grow, they'll be able to provide jobs and deliver services and improve the general livelihood of people. But when we look at the model of sustainable development, it tells us that a focus on the economy alone is not sufficient, because the economy is embedded within the social system, which itself is embedded within the environmental system. And all of these three dimensions are underpinned by solid or good governance. So we need to look beyond just the economics. We need to look just beyond the social. We need to look beyond the understanding of the environment to also think about how we organize ourselves to respond to all of this. So what are we proposing? Africa is uniquely positioned. It is rich and abundant natural resources. So how do we leverage our position and geographical advantage? How do we leverage our climate? How do we leverage that we've got a lot of arable land? How do we leverage the fact that the majority of mega diverse, which are countries which have the most biodiversity, are located here, South Africa being one of those mega diverse countries? How do we leverage that to start charting a way out of this situation that serves not just our food security, but balances it with the environment, human health, socioeconomic, and well-being concerns of the general population? So the point that I'll be trying to make in this presentation going forward is there is strength in our diversity in Africa. And it's not just the diversity of people that we have, it's also the diversity of flora and fauna that we have. And it's also the diversity of cultures that we have. We have been working for many years since I joined the University of KwaZulu-Natal on a particular subset of biodiversity, which is looking at African indigenous crops. And from as early as then in 2008, we were looking at them as future crops to say, how can these crops be deployed to combat climate change? And over the years, our research has proven that, or has provided evidence to show that most or several of these crops are actually suited to the scenarios that we'll be seeing or that we are currently seeing under different climate change experiences. So a great deal of them are adapted to drought and heat stress. Some are tolerant to waterlogging. They are suited to marginal and low input environments, which are places that have poor soils. They do not require a lot of landscape modification, which means they don't require too much mechanization for someone to get started and produce them. Because of their adaptation to these environments, it means they exert less pressure on the ecologies within which they are produced. So that means we are having a smaller, ecological footprint. And that is where agriculture needs to actually transition to meet some of the targets that were set at COP 2016, which will probably be confirmed again in the next coming weeks at COP 27. So how can we tap into some of these African indigenous crops' potential, and how can we leverage that potential to drive a radical transformation of our food systems and general livelihoods? Now, this is a slide that I always like to share in most of my discussions. So we are sitting on a huge treasure trove for food and nutrition, as well as economic development. Now, most of you might not know, but historically, there are around 300 to 500,000 plant species that have been documented to have been used by people. And out of those 30,000 are known to be edible plant species. 7,000 have been recorded as having been cultivated by people throughout history. But over time, we have moved from 7,000 cultivated species to just having 20 that provide 90% of our calories. And in those 20, 3 account for almost 75% of that, being wheat, maize, and rice. So what this is telling us is over time, we have narrowed down on the diversity that is available to us to utilize for food and many other things, food, fiber, forage, and we are focused on a few crops. And what climate change science is telling us for a fact is that in many areas, especially in Africa, the yields of those crops, maize and rice, are going to decline because of declining rainfall, increasing temperatures, and increasing rainfall variability. We've already seen the impact in terms of wheat from the war in Ukraine and how a war happening outside of our continent affected food security in Africa. Just because wheat could not be exported out of Ukraine, we found ourselves having to face price increases because of a wheat shortage. So it has also made us sensitive to global fluctuations and externalities. So what has happened is over time, as we have lost much of this diversity, the vulnerability of our food system has increased because, again, diversity is a strategy to de-risking. Even if you are, talking to an economist, they would advise you to have a diverse investment portfolio. So similarly, in agriculture, we would advise you to have a diverse food system. It de-risks the situation. The less diversity you have, the higher risk you have. If you're just focusing on a few crops and they fail, it spells trouble. At the same time, we've also lost a lot of genetic diversity and resilience, which traditionally and historically underpinned our system. So how did we get here? And how do we move on from here? How do we turn this, triangle upside down into a proper pyramid? How do we start tracing our steps back to those 30,000 edible plants and diversifying our systems? And I've mentioned diversification. What really is the importance of diversification? I mentioned de-risking, which is more in the economic sense, but it's also in the climate sense, to say if you've got a diverse system and there is a flood or there is drought, the chance of everything failing is low compared to the chance where you've got just 2 things on your field and they both fail and you're pushed into hunger quite suddenly. But the importance of diversification also goes beyond just managing risk. There are benefits, linked to climate health core benefits. There are climate environment core benefits, which I mentioned earlier on, that we need to be transitioning to low carbon, forms of agriculture, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in our agriculture, reducing low levels of pesticides and fertilizers, and managing pollution or the environmental impact of agriculture, which in many areas is actually driving a lot of environmental degradation. There's also huge socioeconomic core benefits, as I mentioned, that it reduces the likelihood of crop failure, and also it provides huge opportunities for people in rural areas to participate in a broader system of agriculture, which has lesser barriers of entry. So this is just a summary on the other side of what I've been talking about, to say, on the one end, we've got all of these pressures, these drivers that are putting pressure on the system, and we have to consider the food system from agriculture interacting with the environment and interacting with health. And we quickly learned some of these linkages in the last 2 years due to COVID, how what started out as a public health crisis quickly became a food security emergency in many areas, and there were protests, with people attacking food trucks and so forth. So these things are interlinked. And how do we start tapping into the diversity that we have in Africa through the abundance of these indigenous crops to help ourselves move forward? Now, this is just a picture that shows some of these African, indigenous or traditional crops. You've got your sorghum, your millets, you've got your bambara groundnut, you've got your sweet potato, and we've got a huge wealth of legumes that we have. You've got your taro right across, in Umbumbulu there, where you are. So we've got all these crops, and how do we start tapping into them and benefiting from them? And really, what are the benefits of using them? So I'm going to just share a few examples from the research that we've done in terms of what their potential is. And this is evidence-based, so this is not speculative. This is based on actual research that we have done at the university. So the first example is millets. Most of you might not, be familiar with millets, but before maize came to Africa, so maize is not indigenous to Africa. It came quite later on, with the Portuguese traders. But before we had maize on the continent, we had millets and sorghum. And millets is actually a group. You've got pearl, you've got finger millets, and so forth. So it's a group of small grains, which has very high nutritional value, and it contains some of the critical elements that are missing in people's diets, such as iron, and ascorbic acid. In terms of what we are looking at from a climate change perspective, they are highly drought tolerant. It thrives in waterlogged soil conditions. So what it means is, in those periods when we have flash floods, it will not fail. It will still be able to withstand. And we're looking at a lot of those scenarios under climate change, where we'll have drought periods followed by intermittent flooding. So we need crops that can be able to, survive and withstand. They can fit into a lot of different cropping systems, which are also traditional. And the important thing is they are a multi-purpose crop, which means they can serve both humans and animals. So you can feed it to your animals if you need to. Another example building from there is sorghum. Again, very nutrient dense, good source of B vitamins and a lot in your A, D, E, and K. Good source of 20 minerals Of interest here is iron and zinc, which have been identified as, deficient nutrients in most areas in Africa. Again, similar to your millets, there's good tolerance to abiotic stresses, and it also fits in a lot of cropping systems that are typical of our rural areas and drier or marginal environments. My favorite crop, Bambara groundnut, I actually did my PhD on this crop. It's a fantastic crop. Generally, when we talk of drought tolerance has three dimensions to it. So drought tolerance can be through drought avoidance, which is when plants mature early before it gets too dry, so they avoid the dry. Or it can be drought escape, which is where plants either delay a particular stage to escape the drought. So they, change their phenology to escape the dry period. And we've got tolerance, which is usually linked more to the plant's ability to maintain internal, plant water status. So usually it's very rare to find a crop that possesses all those three attributes of drought tolerance. And Bambara is one of those unique crops that we say, it is the trifecta for drought tolerance, and it is also tolerant to heat stress, very high protein and good carbohydrate content, similar to your millets, the dual purpose crop, so it can be used for human and animal feed. And it is also ideal in very marginal areas, such as in northern KwaZulu-Natal, where you've got poor fertility soils, because it can form part of fertility management because it's a legume and it can fix its own nitrogen. Teff is more popular in East Africa. It is actually the staple there. So if, like our Ethiopian and Eritrean brothers, they love it. It makes their staple food injera. It's also another very good crop with very good drought tolerance. There are people who've been expressing interest to produce it in South Africa in certain environments and wanting to export it. So there's interest in a lot of these crops, but we haven't really tapped into them as such. Another good example is cowpea imbuba, which is a favorite to many Africans, especially in West Africa. It forms a lot of their dishes, but here it's mostly used for animal feed. Very few people eat it. There are some social and cultural perceptions around cowpea that we need to destigmatize and demystify so that we promote its consumption. But again, it's a good source of beta carotene, which is your vitamin A and your vitamin C. And similar to Bambara groundnut, it can be intercropped and it can promote very sustainable forms of agriculture. This is just another legume that most of you would not be very familiar with, leb, but it is an African indigenous crop, and it is an annual crop. It can be used in many cases as a cover crop. So in between your main season, you can grow it so that you maintain cover on the ground to avoid things such as soil erosion during the dry periods. It has very high amounts of protein, and it is also rich in dietary fiber. So it is quite good, especially for breakfast and things like that. It is quite rich in fiber. Tolerant again to your drought and heat stress, and fits within the context of the agriculture that is predominant in the rural areas. Sweet potato, most of you would be familiar with it. It's always been there in the rural areas. The beauty with it is, especially when it comes to, the post-harvest side, that in many cases, one of the challenges that people in the rural areas have is issues of storage. That, if you have a bumper harvest, how do you store it and how do you prolong its use? The beauty with sweet potato is you can harvests as and when you need to consume it. So when it matures, you don't have to go and dig it all out. You can leave some of it in the ground and you can dig it as and when you need it. But it's a very good source of starch, but especially some of the new varieties that we have, like the orange flesh sweet potato, are very rich in beta carotene and vitamin A. And it's often called a poor man's crop or the crop that never fails because it takes a lot for sweet potato to fail, for you to get zero yield. So it is one of those very hardy crops that will rarely fail under a range of extremes. So it's one of the crops that we are looking at and saying we can promote this. It's got very good industrial uses because some of it has got very high starch content, so it can also be used for industrial purposes. So that's where we start seeing also opportunities to bring young people in the rural areas to come in and produce some of these crops and set up small industries in the rural areas, and create value chains that support these crops and can absorb women and young people in the rural areas. My favorite, so the second crop I dealt with during my PhD, taro, amadumbe, and perhaps one of the few success stories around indigenous crops, because this is one of those that made it into the supermarkets, although we haven't been able to push it beyond that. But it's one of those rare success stories because there was actually a successful attempt to commercialize it, but more can still be done. Whilst it is generally known as a water-loving crop, we found some varieties of it in the uplands, the areas of Umbumbulu and some parts of Mtuba that it acquired drought tolerance. So they have significantly low levels of water use compared to the other varieties of taro. So on average, taro is known to use 1,000 milliliters of water, but we found varieties that can do with almost half of that. So there's, again, good potential to use it and to increase its production in certain areas, and also, broaden and diversify the markets to which it has entered. We've recently partnered with a company in Cape Town who are thinking of making potato chips and other products, using the amadumbes. And so it creates new markets and value chains for farmers and youth in rural areas. Marama Bean, again, it's another legume of interest with almost similar characteristics as the other I'd mentioned. In South Africa and much of Africa, we have a high reliance on soybean, and you'd be interested to know that Marama has a protein content which is actually twice as high as that of soybean. So it can actually, replace or be a substitute to soybean in environments where you may not be able to produce soybean due to issues of water stress and poor soil fertility. Amaranth, a lot of you would think it is a weed. You find it in your fields. It's also called pigweed, but it's, others, traditionally it would be referred to as mfino, which is actually a traditional leafy vegetable. And it is very tolerant to drought and heat stress. And the interesting about, amaranth is you can use both the leaves when it is young. You can consume the young leaves as a leafy vegetable, as a relish, and you can also use the grain. So the grain is actually quite rich in protein and also contains, things such as niacin and calcium. So it's got that duality to it. You can harvest the leaves during the season to complement diets or diversify household diets. And when it reaches maturity, you can harvest the seed again. We've done experiments where we've actually managed to grind the seeds into flour and bake biscuits and, muffins and things like that. And we took them into the rural areas to do food testing, type of experiments with our partners in dietetics. And the people really loved them. They didn't know that you could do that with amaranth seeds, that you could actually make a flour and bake cakes and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of potential to these things. And there's a whole movement starting in Europe around the whole grains, where there's a lot of interest and big markets developing around this sort of crops. So there's potential for us to change, the perception from looking at it as a weed to saying how can we actually produce it commercially and tap into the markets. Spider plant is another leafy vegetable again that is indigenous to Africa and with very high nutritional value and fits into a lot of different agroecologies due to its high photosynthetic capacity at high temperatures. So it fits into a wide range of agroecologies with different photoperiod or photoperiodicity. So it's a very good crop to look at. And in South Africa, we've done research around the commercialization of spider plant, and it showed that it has potential to be commercialized at the scale of land of 2 or less hectares, which is the average farm size for smallholder farmers in South Africa. So we know that it can be commercially produced at those scales and it is viable. But what we don't have, are systems to support it. We don't have commercially available seeds, and we still need to develop a value chain to then support the demand. Jute mallow, I think this is the last leafy vegetable that I will give an example of. Again, this one, we call it a functional crop because it has both food and medicinal value. And it has been used mostly for its medicinal purposes, but it is also good for food. It is very tolerant to drought and a lot of other extremes. So the main thing with these crops is their suitability to environments that we know are going to become more and more the norm under climate change, and also environments that we know are in the rural areas and which are marginal and are hard for the major crops or the mainstream crops to be produced at levels that make it viable for farmers to do so. Nightshade is a similar story as I gave. So what I just gave you here, I took some examples of cereals, and I took some examples of root and tuber crops, and I took some examples of legumes, and now we are closing off with some examples of leafy vegetables. What we did around 2017-18 in South Africa is we screened a lot of these crops, and we came up with a list of 15 that we called priority African indigenous crops that we thought if there was going to be investment, those could be the 15 best bet crops that could actually be successful and lead to new value chains. And just to get to the conclusions, we learned a lot from the COVID-19 pandemic when, global food supply chains collapsed, in the importance of local food chains, became more and more visible and more topical. When we had the food riots in KZN last year in July, again, the main supply chains of food collapsed, and what we survived on during that time, for those of us who were around Durban and so, were the local food systems with shorter supply chains. So these crops can be deployed to support those very local food systems with short supply chains that can be more resilient to outside perturbations and disturbances. What does it mean for Africa? The current context of global challenges means that development assistance is already on the decline because of reprioritization of budgets. We are faced with massive and increasing food insecurity. The progress that we had been making, as I mentioned, we lost that progress since 2018, and it worsened when COVID came in. And we are now faced with a situation where most people have admitted that we are not on target to achieve the SDGs by 2030, especially SDG 2 on hunger. So what we need more of, is homegrown solutions, and we need them now. As I mentioned earlier on, a lot of people have been making jokes around why a war somewhere in Europe is affecting food security in Africa, and that is just speaking to the need for homegrown solutions. And the agency is now, and we've got the resources, we've got the biodiversity that is sitting here. We've got the heritage in that these crops have always been part of our culture. They are part of who we are, and they're part of our landscape. So why don't we use them to promote ourselves? Why don't we use them to address issues of hunger? Why don't we use them as part of our climate change adaptation strategy and addressing malnutrition in climate and food security hotspots? Why don't we support them to develop new value chains that can take up a lot of people and young people, in the rural areas, and create new opportunities for empowering people, new businesses with lesser or lower barriers of entry as compared to the mainstream agriculture, which is more dominant. So in conclusion, and as a way forward, so this is pretty much based on almost 10 years of research that I've done during my time at UKZN. I think in understanding, in us taking pride in our heritage, in taking pride in our biodiversity and tapping into it, we need to understand our context. And our context is pretty much that a lot of people still reside in marginal environments and they remain marginalized. In those areas, agricultural yields continue to decline, hunger, malnutrition, and poverty continue to increase. But we are sitting on, huge agrobiodiversity, and many indigenous crops and fruit trees are climate resilient and nutrient dense. In this presentation, I only focus on the crop side of it. There's also a huge, basket of fruit trees that are indigenous to Africa that we could have another conversation around in terms of how do we tap into that. So we need to showcase and value the indigenous knowledge that has underpinned these crops, that has allowed them to survive for years, without any efforts or without any support from science and industry. But local people have continued producing and, retaining the seed, and through own knowledge, they've actually been doing own improvement to these crops in the way that they retain and select seed for the next season. Now, climate change and sustainable development pose an existential threat to our food and, our food security and economic development. And we need to be innovative in terms of how we respond to it. And I think, when we look at this basket of crops, it offers us significant opportunities to think differently, to change the paradigm and play a whole different ballgame in terms of how we respond and play to our strengths in terms of, our heritage, our culture, and our food. And when we take pride in our heritage, our culture, and our food, it gives a huge sense of, restorative justice. It addresses a lot of issues around equity. Because a lot of people who are involved in these crops are women in the rural areas. It also goes a long way in addressing our issues of dignity when we restore to their rightful place these foods that have always formed part of our identity and who we are. And what we need at the end of the day is a fit for purpose equitable, sustainable, and healthy African food system that is underpinned, by Africa's geographic advantage and our natural and social capital, and that has an explicit acknowledgement for our agrobiodiversity in any type of modern and future agriculture. I think that brings me to the end. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you very much, Tafadzwa, for this absolutely awesome talk. I'm very impressed, and I have to say, the only thing that I knew, that I only ate was a sweet potato. So shame on me. This brings us to our question session, and as host, I always reserve the right to ask the first question. Sorry, guys. Because I see this variety, and I see this massive diversity in these food crop plants. But I think, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems is that nobody knows about. Us Westerners, I call us Westerners, don't really know about it. They don't know what they taste like, and they don't know how to prepare it, and so on. Do you think that this is one of the big challenges that you face, that people don't really know? I mean, apart from indigenous people, don't really know how to use this type of food.
Thanks, Tanya. So knowledge and awareness is one of the big gaps, that there's low levels of awareness. So even amongst the indigenous people, the knowledge has been lost over time. We've gone to communities where we were working to reintroduce, some of these crops, and the knowledge had been lost. Only a few very old people could remember a time when they were growing these crops and utilizing them. We had to bring people from other communities who still had the knowledge to come in and demonstrate how to cook it, how to prepare meals from these crops, and so forth. So there's a huge aspect that is around building awareness. And there's also the aspect of changing perceptions, that in a lot of cases, some of it is viewed either as a weed or as a poor man's crop, as something that people would want to move away from and not towards. So we need to change those perceptions, and in terms of how we rebrand these African indigenous crops.
Thank you, Tafadzwa. And I see, the questions are just pouring in. Let me just ask, Balungile, you wanna unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, yes. Hi, everyone. I think someone answered me in the chat. They said, besides amaranths being found most commonly in the wild, cleums are also the indigenous crops that you can also find in the wild. Is this true? Is this correct?
Tafadzwa, can you confirm?
Can you come again? I missed you a bit there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yes. My question was, besides the amaranths, which other indigenous crops can be commonly found in the wild, like not necessarily cultivated, but found naturally growing in the wild?
A lot of them, actually. You've got like, the Cleom ginandra that I gave you, you find it in the wild. You've got wild mustard. You also find it growing in the wild. You'd also be interested to know that blackjack can also be consumed. It is highly nutritious, especially if you harvest the young, immature leaves. They can be consumed as food. So a lot of things that you might see passively in the wild could actually be consumed as food.
Okay, thank you. So I'm guessing, or I'm just thinking right now that most of these crops, we are not very sensitized to them. Like you can just pass them by or see them as weeds or just grass that needs to be burnt or something like that. So I could say that another challenge is that we are not generally sensitized to them. Maybe how can we
Yes, that
move forward from that, like getting more sensitized to such crops that we can't like visibly or easily identify with.
So one of the things that we are trying to do is we are putting this information into brochures that we can disseminate more widely for people to just know the crops that are available for them to use as food. And also combining it, we've been doing some good work with Professor Suela Uzie and Laurentia Govender around developing recipes for these crops as substitutes. Say, you know, you can cook a meal and substitute dry beans with bambara. You can remove spinach and place amaranth. So we're trying to package that information into brochures, take it outside of the science domain. Right now it is, you know, in the science domain, and make it available for public consumption. We are partnering with the Water Research Commission to try and, you know, have a road show where we go around having cook-off shows with celebrity chefs to just come and prepare dishes using these crops, you know, fancy dishes and so forth, just to build up the hype and excitement around them and, you know, sensitize people, as you said.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next question. Paul, do you wanna ask your question, please? And Johanna, please.
Okay.
Is there a particular reason for this?
For who?
Hello.
Am I audible?
We have just have somebody sharing the screen, but don't worry. Paul, if you want to ask a question, please.
Okay, no, I think I was answered because he mentioned something about them going on a road show and trying to conscientize people about this in the indigenous crops. The thing I would want to know whether would it be possible to domesticate this indigenous crops to an extent where we can grow them commercially and produce them in mass production. Thank you.
Yes, most of them have actually been domesticated. And they've all been produced, you know, at levels that can demonstrate that they can be commercialized at a more local scale. So there is that potential.
Does it answer your question? Paul?
Yeah, yes, it does. Yes, it does. But then I think that the other element, I think it's another comment which was mentioned here that drives home the message that majority of small scale farmers, because I believe this is in line with them, majority of them, they would actually move away from these crops and adopt your commercial crops, your cabbages and spinaches, because they are more lucrative compared to these indigenous crops. Even if you say they've been domesticated, being produced at a commercial scale, could they be at the level that which a farmer can get enough profit that he can survive?
So I'll give you an example. You'll find if you walk into some of these fancy supermarkets, you pay more for a small bundle of Cleome than you pay for spinach or you pay for cabbage. So it's all a matter of branding. In a lot of places where the markets are now coming up, they are being branded as superfoods because of that aspect of nutrition that I was talking about. So we in South Africa, and this is happening in Europe, you know, where they're being called superfoods, and there are markets that are emerging there. that have a demand for them. But the thing is, how do we ensure that when the growth comes for these crops, when that revolution happens, that it benefits us? It just doesn't become something that we export to Europe. It becomes something that we own as an African crop. We benefit from it. The farmers who've always been producing from it are the first ones to get onto that sort of market. So there's a lot of activities that have to happen in between. We need policy support from government in order to support these sort of crops. Farmers in rural areas will generally not produce them because they don't receive support in terms of input support from government. When government delivers seeds, no one delivers seeds of any of these crops. They'll deliver maize and dry beans and those sort of things. We need to look at the marketing side and deliberately rebrand them so that we create that demand ourselves. We need to build that awareness in society and the knowledge of how to utilize them so that again, it creates that demand. So if there is demand and supermarkets are buying it, farmers naturally will gravitate towards that market, which is paying. So I think, like I said, there are several steps in between that we need to walk in order to translate this potential into reality.
Okay, no, thank you, Prof. Thank you, highly appreciated. I hope to have a collaboration with you from the University of Limpopo. It's very interesting what you're doing. Thank you, thank you.
Okay, great. Abdul Mumin has also a question. You want to unmute yourself and ask the question? Otherwise, I can ask the question. So there's, okay, so hi, Prof. Is nightshade similar to black pepper as the botanical name indicates?
It's the same family. So when we talk, the botanical name tells you of the family. So it's the same family in that context. So in terms of the management, the sensitivity to diseases and so forth, it would be similar, more or less.
Okay, and Funanani has also a question about the nightshades, which seems to be quite interesting. Funanani, you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Okay, hello. In terms of the nightshade, I wanted to know if any work has been done on the purple seeds of fruits, because we eat them in Limpopo as well. So I just wanted to know if any work has been done in terms of the fruits itself, the purple fruits.
Yes, some preliminary work has been done on the fruit, and we're looking at the impact of sequential harvesting to say, if we are harvesting the leaves sequentially, how does it affect the flowering and the quality of the flowers? And it was mostly from the context of knowing that there are communities that also eat them. So it has been done, but to a limited extent in terms of looking at the impact of sequential harvesting on fruiting and quality.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then let me just find Michael Ongulana also has a question, which I think is actually quite important one. Michael, you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? I think he's not here. Okay. All right, then I'll ask the question for him. Are there any homegrown solutions to wheat?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, sorry, Michael. Sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the presentation. I just, as I posted, I just want to be sure that I'm hearing about different things that could be used to help us increase bread production, because bread is now becoming so expensive because of this. We hear that it's because of the war in Ukraine. So Are there homegrown solutions to this?
Yes, there are several cereals, some of which I mentioned there, that can be considered as alternatives. And most of these African indigenous cereals also have the advantage of being gluten-free. So there's that attraction as well. The only reason why currently, they cannot be an immediate substitute for wheat is because of the low levels of production. If you look at the quantities of wheat that we were importing versus the quantities of turf that we are producing locally and so forth, it's insignificant to meet that deficit that has been created by the war in Ukraine. But if we were to then take this as a moment, take this war as a moment of reflection, to say, what have we learned from this war? That we are vulnerable, and what do we have on the continent that is a viable alternative? And how do we start promoting these and increasing their production so that over a period of time, we reduce our dependency on these wheat imports and we increase the production of the alternatives that we have locally available. So it becomes a matter of policy and a matter of the industry, the private sector, partnering then or responding to the policy direction of government to come in and support these crops. So it's more public-private partnerships that we need to see in this space.
I think our time is up almost, but before we're gonna close off, I just want to quickly announce, first of all, I would like to say thank you very much, Tafadzwa. This is really for showing us the way forward, and showing us these super duper interesting crops. And I would like to announce our next talk. So please, we have another very exciting talk coming up by Professor Rob Slaughter on elephants and society. And if you just give me a second, I've got some comments from him on this. So on the 1st of December, it's a Thursday this time, we will welcome Professor Rob Slaughter, and he will enlighten us on elephants in society. And this talk actually goes beyond the biological and explores the importance of considering social and societal aspects concerning elephants, which have broad values to society. So please, guys, don't miss next month's talk on Thursday, the 1st of December. Again, I would like to take this opportunity to thank several people, Sally Frost as being the main driving force behind, the scene, and Asok Raj for all this design work that he does. And now, please, if you please fill in your poll and also unmute yourself and give Professor Tafadzwa a very, very big round of applause. Thank you very much. It was an absolute great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
And I think it's absolutely. I'm pretty sure that we could just stay on and just talk, but unfortunately the time is up. Again, join us next month on the 1st. And I hope to see you back then. Good evening, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Hi from Lesotho.